Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. Sadly, just one guy here. Best new comics of the week. Mike is out of town for a little bit, so he didn't get a chance to pick up his books, but wanted to make sure we went over the best bit of a stack here, about 6 or 7 books this week to recommend. Very light DC Comics week, but a decent week for Marvel and two really strong indie entries for this week. And one book was really, really surprising for me that made the list. But I'll start with the book of the week. And weirdly, for the first time in a long time, it is not Conan. It is the book of the week. It made the list, but I'm going to start with what I thought was the best book this week. It is the book Skinbreaker, #1, David Finch and Robert Kirkman, recommended to me from a person at the store that I go to. One of the great things about going to a local comic shop is you'll get folks who recommend books to you. I'm a huge David Finch fan. I love his versions of Batman that he did. That Batman, the Dark Knight series, maybe not plot-wise the best Batman story, but man, that art in that issue, those issues that he had was just absolutely phenomenal. And I think David Finch is one of the absolute best. But this is the best artwork of his career. This book is just absolutely incredible. There's so much fantastic art. The plot is pretty good, as you'd expect from Robert Kirkman, but it is just an artist showcase. If you love comic book art, if you just want to see an artist at the top of their game, going all out on the details and everything, it's hard to find a better looking comic book from this. I don't, outside of Rob De La Torre's first couple of issues on Conan, where he just knocked it out of the park. I don't remember the last time I saw an artist just go with this much detail. So much in this book just looks fantastic. It's a decent plot. It's pretty interesting. And I think overall there is some good things here. Largely, this is kind of it seems like sort of an alien sort of tribe that's going on. Not a lot of backstory is given, but you have this sort of passing of the torch story. There's this chieftain who is losing his power and he's pushing, this young successor, and then there's a challenger who comes in and with it. I'm not going to spoil too much of this book. I think it's just absolutely worth your time to pick it up. But largely, you kind of have a decent sort of plot that's very familiar to a lot of kind of tropes in movies and things like that. But overall, this was a fantastic comic book in terms of the art alone. It was the best book this week, not by a huge margin over Conan, but it was significantly, just the best looking comic I've seen in years. And so I think if you love comic book art, if that is what gets you into the medium, cannot recommend this one high enough. It's just absolutely fantastic. David Finch at the absolute top of his game. That was a great, great comic there. The second book that I'll mention for this week, Conan, Scourge of the Serpent. Jim Zub on this one, along with Gil on the art. This is largely building off of the Conan event that has been building for the last couple of months. And overall, this is what you'd expect out of a Conan comic book. The art from Gil in this is really, really good. And I think one of the things that he does great in this is much like last year's Conan event that took place, the Battle of Blackstone, this is shifting between different eras of Robert E. Howard's characters, and so you have it bouncing back and forth. You have Conan showing up in this book. You have Cole the Conqueror showing up in this book. You just have all kinds of different things that are being shown throughout. And I think one of the great things that he does is throughout the book, there's just such distinctive visual styles that take place because you're showing the early 1930s. When you get kind of John Kirwan in here, you're showing the Borean Age with Conan, you're showing Atlantis with Cole. It's just a really well put together story, and it's what you'd expect out of a Conan book. There's a lot of intrigue, a lot of action, and I think overall, this entire plot that has been put together the last 6 months, this to me has been the best Conan's ever been in terms of a plot standpoint. I think this event is going to absolutely deliver. Again, could it fail? I could, but I would very much doubt it with how much effort's been put into this and how much they typically do with Conan. I think overall, again, if you have been enjoying the Conan comic books, this is what you're looking for. If you're new to it, the only caveat that I'll put to it, if you are brand new to Conan, if you have not read some of the stuff before, it's not impossible for you to pick up where this is, but it is rather difficult. And I think one not critique, but I think thing that I would say is I feel like Battle of the Blackstone last year was a very strong entry in that I think if you were reading the books, you absolutely could pick it up and know what was going on and you had a little more context. But if you were a brand new reader, you could pick it up and you'd be right along with it. I do feel like Scourge of the Serpent is a little more reliant on if you've been reading, which I think you should be. But I would say if you're a brand new reader, this may not be the greatest jumping on point, or you may have a little more questions. But overall, I think this was a lot of great build up, a lot of good stuff in there, and the art from Gill is fantastic. It's what you'd expect out of Conan. That just continues to be a book that is incredibly solid. And I think what I will give this a ton of credit. We are so used to event books being disappointing when they come from the big two. They typically seem like these manufactured things that are just designed to extract some extra dollars out of you. This genuinely has some great build-ups, some great character moments. It's capitalizing on everything that's come before, and I think it's just fantastic. I would absolutely recommend this one to anybody who's been reading Conan. Third entry on the list as well, also coming from the indie space, The Phantom #1. This is from Mad Cave Comics. We got Ray Fox and Russell Olson on this one. Phantom, could be the first superhero ever, really. It's debatable whether it's him or Zorro as far as kind of the first sort of superhero character. He is very much the kind of trope for the Batmans and all the sort of characters there, the inspiration behind it. And this very much kind of captures classically what you'd expect out of the Phantom. I'll be honest, I don't have a ton of exposure to the character. I love the mid-90s movie with Billy Zane. I think was pretty good. And obviously I've seen some of the old, classic strips of the character and things like that, the old comic strips that exist. But this had a very good free comic book day issue. I think what this story is going to do, there's a lot of good balance in this of action, a little bit of plot, some strong character moments. And I think for myself, as someone who's not incredibly familiar with the world of the Phantom, it was a good entryway point. I think it does what a #1 issue is supposed to, which is kind of get you acclimated to the world, set some things up, establish some stakes, put you kind of in the environment of the characters. I thought this was really strong. Do I think it was to the level like what Flash Gordon was a couple years ago with Man Cave? Not quite, but I do think if you're looking for something fresh, something that you can jump into, I think this is a really good book. I will say the art from Olsen is pretty good as well, and there's some cool use of shadow and different things when they show the Phantom in action. Overall, I think it's a really, really cool book, and I'm excited to see where the series will go. So I think that was a really strong first entry for that series as well. Four other books that I'll mention. Actually, three Marvel comic books for this week. So, Spider-Man and Wolverine, #5 on this. Kari Andrews on art, and then I believe it's still Mark Guggenheim writing on this thing. Continuing this incredibly cool plot thread of sort of showing Logan's past and that kind of intertwined with Peter Parker's parents' death. I think it was a really cool choice by Guggenheim to intertwine the characters in that way. There's great dynamics between Logan and Peter Parker in this book in terms of you get that classic kind of good cop, bad cop, lethal weapon sort of vibe between the two characters. There's great banter, great strong character moments. It's kind of amazing to me that we haven't really ever had an extended run of these two characters teaming up and that they're both so popular and they bounce off each other really well. Kari Andrews arc not going to be for everybody. I do think there is going to be, some moments with this where people, may not love it as much. But I do think for a superhero book and for Kari Andrews' style, I think there's enough in here that works. And I think the cool thing that they're doing is putting these characters in their classic costumes and kind of mixing things up a little bit is pretty cool. There's some revelations about the villain in this book and sort of the consequences of not killing and that the villain essentially is motivated by non-action by Peter Parker. And I think it's an interesting thread. It's nothing we haven't seen before. I believe in Batman they did this a couple years ago, where the main villain was someone who was inspired by the fact that Batman didn't kill one of his villains and therefore his family suffered. And so it's nothing we haven't seen before, but I do think that's always an effective thread and a way to kind of examine the no-kill rule of superheroes. I like the way it was presented here, and I thought there was some really strong character work with Wolverine, where he felt like he should be a more gruff, tough kind of character. He's not compromised, but there's also that kind of man with honor who respects what Peter Parker is. And so there were some good character moments. I've really enjoyed this series. I hope, unlike most Marvel series, that this doesn't get canceled at issue 10. We're seeing so many of these books get canceled early on. I think there's a lot of potential for this. I would think the sales would justify it continuing, but it's really cool. And I think there's some promised threads at the end of this of some of these villains for both Spider-Man and Wolverine teaming up to face the two of them, which is really interesting because I think it would be great to explore that a little further. But overall, I think it's just a fun comic book. What I'll say is this the best written book? Is this something where you're going to be like, oh, it's an instant classic? No. What I do think this is doing really well is if you miss comics as they used to be in the 80s and 90s to 70s, where it's just good characters, fun plot, enjoying the character dynamics, not trying to say something, just instead taking great characters, having them act in character, throwing them to a plot that works. I think this is great, and I think you'll enjoy it if you like these two characters. Caveat again being, I know for some folks the art is not going to be for everybody. Last couple books we'll mention here. The Mortal Thor #2. Mike and I really enjoyed the first issue of this. Again, I'm not a big Al Ewing guy, but I do think overall this is an intriguing plot. We kind of build off that first issue where Thor is obviously kind of mortal now in this, and so we have him dealing with the consequences of him attacking those employees from Roxxon who were harassing him in the last issue. We get some really cool action in this and some cool use of the hammer and Thor kind of having a very cool fight scene at the end. And I'll give Al Ewing some credit. I thought the way that was sort of scripted and put together, I thought was really unique and interesting and showcased some cool things about Thor. Obviously, we get some hints that there's more going on, which you'd expect in this, that are subtle. And I liked the way they were integrated and that you're still invested in this plot line of what's happened to Thor in his day-to-day life and where he's at. But there's enough kind of going on in the background that lets you know there's a larger plot happening, and I think that was subtly built into it. Again, I'm not a huge Al Ewing guy, but I think this was a well executed issue, and it certainly means that I'll be back for the next couple of issues with this. Pascal Ferry's on the art on this. I think he did a decent job with this. I'm just not the biggest fan of his style, but I do think the overall plot that's put together here is interesting enough that it's got me back reading Thor, and I had dropped it on Al Ewing's run previously. The last page, there is a revelation that it looks like Donald Blake, who used to be Thor's secret identity, and I believe during Donny Cates' run, and he became an independent entity that was sort of evil. It does appear they're bringing that plot thread back, and I was not a huge fan of when that was executed, so I think it will be interesting to see how that is done. But overall, I think it's interesting to see Thor in a situation where he does have a little bit more of a personal life, a little bit of a throwback to the earlier days of Thor, where he feels a little more connected to humanity. And I think that's always a good thing. So overall, I like this second issue. I'll be back for the third issue. And I would not have expected that from this series when I first picked it up. Another surprise book that made the list for me this week is X-Men #22 from Jed MacKay with CF Via on the art. Overall, look, I have been out of the X-Men game for a bit, but Mike and I have talked a lot about, wanting to get back into X-Men and really give this Age of Revelation event a chance. And so a little bit lighter week for me this week in terms of my books. I decided to pick this one up. And overall, I thought it was pretty interesting. I was a little lost on the plot threads of what's going on, but I do think this Jed MacKay one was the only strong sort of entry at the start. I eventually ended up dropping because there was just too much focus on newer characters. But there were some actually interesting things in here where, apparently in the previous issues, Juggernaut had killed someone on behalf of the X-Men in a fight. And there was some interesting pages in here with Beast kind of being like upset about that and very much objecting and kind of representing that old classic X-Men approach of like, when did we all get so comfortable with killing and kind of losing his mind over it with Juggernaut? And I think that was kind of cool. And I don't know if that's, being presented in a way where this is, maybe them hinting that they need to get back to that. I'm hoping that's more the representative of what they're trying to push the X-Men to, where, maybe Beast is kind of the voice of a certain audience where it's like, hey man, we need to get back to the event, to the X-Men not doing that. I certainly hope so. But I think this was a strong entry. You also get the arrival of Revelation at the end. Doug Ramsey and kind of does the plot setup for this big event they're doing with Age of Revelation. Does it make the most sense? No, but I do think this was a pretty strong comic book. I loved the examination of that by Beast. And if Mike and I are going to call out X-Men when it's bad, I think when they do something right and they take some steps in the right direction, we should call that out too. And I will say, as much as I had dropped this series, I decided to kind of get back in before this event. The first issue back was pretty good. I thought the art by CFVA was pretty good as well. I'll be interested to see where it goes. And again, I'm not saying that the book is back on the right track, but I do think this was a strong entry that I did enjoy. And so I'd mark that there. Last comic I'll mention, and this barely makes a recommends for me, but I do think it's interesting. Immortal Legend Batman #2. The Elseworld story. Kyle Higgins is on this one with Matt Groening art. Um, Look, it's not a classic representation of Batman at all, but what I will say is this is under the Elseworlds banner. And I, as a fan of those older Elseworlds comic books that came out, in the 80s and 90s and things like that, I love when they take kind of a wild swing approach and throw the mythology kind of in a mixer and see what comes up. And so there's some things in this where Batman's not acting like Batman. It does seem like that's part of the plot of them trying to figure out what's going on. The characters are all put in very different situations. There was a really cool redesign for like a futuristic version of Bane in this comic book that I thought was pretty cool. And I think the art overall is not bad. It's very different. And what I'll say with this is I think the costume design of Batman that they're going with. It's a cool kind of futuristic-esque costume. Again, it's a wild swing. If you're looking for classic Bruce Wayne Batman and you're going to judge it based on what would Bruce Wayne in the modern continuity or what we know him to be, what would he do? You're going to be disappointed. There's some scenes at the beginning where kind of seems like to get more intertwined into the villain's plot. Bruce seemingly allows some folks to actually meet their end, and that hit me weird. But again, I had to remind myself it's an Elseworld story. This is not the main continuity Batman. It's a different story. It's like set in space in the future, and there's a lot of things going on with it. And I think if you just check out a little bit on the fact that it's just taking the mythology to a different place. And I think these Elseworld stories, they can be fun. I love that they're giving us multiple issues, and this used to be a great part of comic books, was those Elseworlds comics. And so there's enough there that I think you can enjoy it if you love the Elseworlds banner. If you're more looking for traditional Batman, it's not going to be for you. And again, I love the traditional Batman stories. But I think the character's versatile enough, and I think DC has had a really good legacy of doing these type of stories and delivering. And so I think there is some enjoyment to be found there. But that would be it for the best new comics of the week. Let me know what you think down below. If there's a book that I missed this week or something that you think is good or particularly strong, let me know. As always, folks, thank you for watching. Hope you have a great weekend. God bless you. You have a great rest of your day.